It's just gone 9 a.m. on Monday, the 17th of July, and that means the embargo has just lifted on the MG4 Excite 51. I'm therefore free to tell you what I thought of it. I drove it recently for a couple of days. Actually, all the media participants to the first drive experience had duos days in the car. Fortuitously though, mine started on a Friday, so it ended on a Monday, and that meant I got the weekend in between. So I drove the car quite a bit, and I'd like to do a report in three parts for you. The first part is just what I thought of it overall, the positives, which greatly outweigh the negatives in my view. I've got a few criticisms though, and at the end I'm going to tell you how this car upended me, like it massively upended me on my very first drive, and I'll tell you exactly why. This doesn't happen very often anymore. I mean, it used to from time to time. I'll just turn the damn sound off on my laptop, sorry about that. It doesn't happen very often, right? Used to a bit in the past, but I've been doing this for like 35 years now, and it's very rare for a car to just completely stump me. I was in a driveway, and I'm having a runtime error in my head, and I'd be surprised if I wasn't leaking blood from one or more ears trying to sort out this particular problem after about an hour of driving the thing, okay? So that's hilarious. We'll get to that right at the end. And before I tell you about the drive per se, I want to tell you why I'm going live, okay? So I'm going live because this is the opportunity to answer some of your questions live, right? I could do a pre-recorded package, and in fact I have got one in production, but that doesn't give me the opportunity to address any questions you've got about the car live. So if you are fortunate enough to be tuning in right now at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, when you should be working from home, then I'll do my best in about half an hour's time to start getting into those questions in the comments feed, okay? So stand by for that. And I also wanted to make some comments about, exactly how every time you talk about an EV, there's such a tribalism thing happening in society about so many things. I mean, it's pretty obvious. You get climate activists and you get LGBT alphabet people who are very tribal about this and that, whether they identify as the Harbour Bridge or something. So everyone's in a tribe, and there is definitely a tribe of EV evangelists, and it's hard to imagine just how strictly they adopt their code of ethics, or they adhere to their code of ethics in their tribe, right? But if you go to an event like the Fully Charged Live thing that was in Sydney, I don't know, 7 or 8 months ago now, you'll see that tribe in action. And it's gobsmacking to see, because up front, I've got to say that if you think the car you buy next is going to make any difference to the climate, then you're off with the fairies, because cars are being weaponized. Electric cars are being weaponized as the solution to the climate problem, and frankly they are anything but. Like, if we just get Harry Potter's magic wand and we wave it tomorrow and change every one of the 18.5 million light vehicles in Australia, if we change them to EVs tomorrow, and we don't take into account the staggering impost on natural resources that it would take to do that, then and we never use thermal coal to charge them up overnight. If we do all of that stuff, so we're pretty much in fantasy land right now, but if we did that, it would make 8% difference to our total national greenhouse emission. 8%, all right? And that's not nothing, but it's not a solution to the climate problem, is it? So you've got to think about electric cars through that paradigm. Okay, you're not going to make a difference to the climate by buying one, but it might be right for you. You can make a difference to national energy security. You can change the amount of pollution in our cities, and they're both extremely positive things that flow from the adoption of EVs, but it's not the evangelical component, really, is it? That's not how the evangelical business works. So if you're thinking about buying the MG4, in particular the version I drove was the Excite 51. It could be right for you for a whole bunch of reasons, but frankly it would be better for you to do other things and advocate at a policy level for the government to start getting its finger out of its rectum and making real change when it comes to solving the climate problem. Because it's great to talk about electric cars, and it's great if you're the government to talk about electric cars, because cars are a thing that we can all relate to. We're all stuck in traffic all day long. We kind of all hate that. And therefore you can weaponize the car as a major component of being seen to be doing something on the climate front, when in fact what's happening is the current government is just as bad as its predecessor at greenlighting a whole bunch of projects which are frankly as terrible as you could imagine for the climate. All these gas projects have been greenlit off the northwestern coast of Australia, for example, and all the thermal and metallurgical coal that we export, the fact that nobody's really come up with a solution for an alternative to metallurgical coal, which essentially is used to turn iron into steel, and it's such a pivotal, integral part of the industrialisation of humanity, right? We can't live in a world currently without metallurgical coal. So these things really matter, and the car that you buy next is not part of the climate solution, not really. It's certainly not a major component, is what I'm saying. So all the evangelists have the shits with me right now, and all the climate change deniers, which is another tribal group, they've got the shits with me now for proposing the preposterous to them view that climate change is real. And yet, you know, in here in the middle where I'm not in a tribe at all, these things both really matter, you know, they both do. So here's the thing about the MG4 Excite 51. If you're thinking about buying one, I give this car the biggest tick imaginable for being the closest thing to the ideal EV that you can buy in Australia right now. Okay, we'll get into that in just a sec, but one of the critical questions is, what's it going to cost me? And much has been made of the 38,990 plus on-road costs pricing, which is very sharp and has only recently been undercut by the base model BYD Dolphin, which is $100 cheaper, but several $1,000s worse in terms of its objective performance. Okay, the top spec Dolphin is actually not a bad thing on paper, but the base model poverty pack is an extremely cynical EV, and I can't make the case to buy one over and above the MG4 Excite 51 because, anyway, we'll get into the why of that, but this thing is, in my view, the closest thing to the sweet spot of the EV that needs to be deployed more widely. We've got more than enough big heavy EVs, more than enough luxury EVs, and what we actually need is more of a mainstream EV for mainstream Australians in mainstream society. And 38,990 is not ridiculous for a Corolla-sized car, even though this thing on a spec level is reasonably, let's call it poverty. It's actually not that bad, but it is the entry level, and therefore in the vernacular it's the poverty pack. If you're lucky enough to be able to take advantage of a novated lease, however, meaning if you're a worker who gets wages or a salary or something from an employer, then you're in the box seat to take advantage of all of the federal government incentives over and above the incentives that might be handed out to you on a state-by-state basis. And they vary at the moment from $0 in Victoria to $6,000 in Queensland, $3,000 in South Australia, in New South Wales, I think, and over in WA, I think it's $3,500. Don't quote me on any of that, but there are those handouts over and above this. But the federal government is going to eliminate FBT from your novated lease if you buy a plug-in hybrid or a full EV below a certain limit. And trust me, the MG4 is well inside that limit. And that means for you, I did the numbers with my novated leasing partners recently, and this is based on New South Wales registration, making $70,000 worth of income a year we're doing the finance over 5 years, driving 15,000 Ks a year with a 28-ish% residual, the impact on your take-home pay is going to be $140 a week, right? And that makes the MG4 Excite 51 a pretty attractive proposition compared with, for example, getting conventional car finance on something like a Corolla. So there's that. The new incentives, particularly from the federal government, have really changed the landscape for the hurdle, the burden of acquisition, if you like, the financial burden. It's really changed that. It's made the EV a much more cost-effective proposition compared with internal combustion, and that's another reason, not so much for joining the tribe, but maybe considering getting off the fence and buying one of these alternative powertrain cars, because it's just going to be cheaper than getting finance on an internal combustion car. And I'm also told, quote, from my novated leasing dudes, that if you want to get paid back for your electricity use, it's going to be $7 a week more than that, so $146 a week out of pocket, which is going to cover $630 a year to be reimbursed for your electricity with no invoices required, just show your odometer. So in addition to, less pollution in our cities and better energy security for the nation, then you could also be looking down the barrel of buying your next car as an EV because it's just going to be cheaper to own. Of course, your employer has to be amenable to the concept of novated leasing, and not all employers are. I'm just going to fix up the whole shot here a little bit and come in a little bit closer to you. A little bit more intimacy there, if you don't mind. I certainly don't mind. It doesn't make any difference to me. So I'm basically saying that this is a real contender for a great many people, even though previously it may not have been. Now, what do I mean when I say this is the closest thing to the EV that mainstream Australia needs? Well, when you look at brands that I would typically associate with being mainstream brands like Hyundai and Kia, for example, and the EVs that they currently deploy, they're all these big, heavy, lardy-assed EVs like the Ioniq 5 and 6. And we've got the Kia EV6 currently being shown in its GT trim, sliding sideways around a racetrack because that's so relevant to ordinary people. And there's also the big, even more lardy-assed EV9 in the wings, when what Australians really need is like an electric Picanto. And I'd suggest that the MG4 is not an electric Picanto, for example. It's not that size. It's like Corolla size. It's i30 Corolla Mazda 3 sized car. And one of the big things that I really like about it, it's not trying too hard to be an EV from the outside. Sure, it looks a little bit different. It's its own thing, but it's not gagging to be an extra on Star Trek anytime soon. You know how some EVs just look like too much EV, not enough car? Well, from the outside, MG4 is not that. It's kind of enough car to fit in, and it's different enough to think, maybe there's something different about that car, kind of thing, right? Now, what I'd suggest, however, is that inside, it really is trying a little bit too hard to be an EV, and I'll get to that in the criticism section. But if we think about inside and outside, when you jump inside, there's going to be a bit of adaptation required from you just to accommodate its intrinsic EV-edness, and I'll get into that in some detail in just a sec, right? Driving this car is really good. Overall, it's just magnificently better than I thought it would be. It's the first MG I've ever driven, and I understand it's the latest generation product, and it's been deployed, MG4, in Europe, for example, for months and months and months. So there's plenty of reviews online, and the vehicle I drove was a pre-production version, and I think it's the UK spec. So a few things are up in the air about that. Like, I don't know if the tyres on that car are the actual production tyres, and the reversing camera was not working in the car that that's a known thing. It was as a consequence of it being a pre-production version. So, you know, you engage reverse and all you see is a snowy screen instead of a clear picture of what the camera's seeing behind you. It's like reversing in an old car, really. You had to do it with the mirrors and spatial perception. Who knew? Okay, so there was that. But overall, cars only do three things. They only accelerate, brake and steer, okay? And on that pure dynamics front, 2 thumbs up, dude. This car is awesome. And it is rear-wheel drive. It has excellent weight balance. Like, it's got 50-50 weight distribution, so there's no excuses for it being crap. And I would also say that it's kind of biased towards being a little bit harsh, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean like taut, as opposed to roly-poly and not really that engaged with the driving process. It's a good, without being hot, it's a sort of warm steering experience in traffic, and I got out of it in... You pick these cars up in Fallujah by the Bay, otherwise known as Sydenham, right? And you can, when you get in the car, you can probably take your Kevlar vest off because most of the danger is past, right? They bring it out, you get in it, and I drove it to my home in the northern suburbs of Sydney. So this is a big drive across town sort of thing, right? And if you're familiar with Sydney, what I did was, instead of going just on the toll roads, I did a big loop in stop-start traffic. So I went down the old Parramatta Road without going in the tunnel, and I went way around in a big loop and Concord Road, and then I went down Victoria Road and went up Marsden Road and went up Pennant Hills Road, and by that I was done with red traffic lights and the whole stop-start traffic light shuffle. But it was a really good assessment opportunity for the kind of driving that this car is really going to do. So that was great. And I got back here and it had more than 80%. I think it was 83% range remaining. And that tells me that if you were using that car for its intended purpose, which is all of that running around that you need to do to get the kinds of things done that you need to do during the day, be that dad to the station, kids to school, pick up the groceries, go to the gym, whatever, then this car has more than enough range to do that for days and days in between charges. Like, I could do 6 of those drives without sucking on a dry tank of electrons, which is quite positive, really. So that's nice. And when I drove it home and I plugged it into the charger, charging it up, seamless. Like, no instructions required. You just, the worst thing about it was that I've got this really steep driveway. It's like the north face of the Eiger. It's atypically steep. And a lot of cars have problems with it. And MG4 was one of those cars that had a problem with my driveway because of its intrinsic steepness. And that starts with the approach angle compromise when you come from the apron on the footpath to the driveway. And the fact that you've got to back it up because the charger is on an external wall of the house, driveway up like this, and the cord, the lead on the charger, is insufficiently long to reach around to the rear of the car. So you've got to get wherever the charge point is closer to the charger. And that means, in this case, backing it up. And that was kind of a real problem. That was the most demanding piece of driving I did in that car because I had to do it at speed and it's curved, and that's technically challenging. But in any case, that's not going to be the kind of burden that many people will face with the car. And when I finally got it to the frickin' charger, charging it's dead easy. You don't need instructions for it. You just get out of the car, plug it in, turn the charger on, wait. It's perfect, okay? That worked really well. So that's kind of intuitive. And overall, I really liked driving it. You know, dynamically it's good, the brakes are good. There's a really good transition from on the gas. I know there's no gas, right? But from on the gas to off the gas, and this has to be engineered in software. That transition is really good. And with the regen sort of in the middle of the range, if you're looking far enough ahead, you can just get off the gas and stop at the lights without actually touching the brake. And that's just one of those games you can play with yourself in traffic instead of going insane with how shitful it is, because that's not really driving. That's just wasting your life in traffic getting from A to B kind of thing. So, yeah, I enjoyed driving it. And it was better than I had expected. I don't know if I had the wrong preconception, the wrong preset loaded in my head for what MG was, and I know this is the latest generation product, but it was better than I had ballparked it would possibly be when at the outset. It impressed me as being better than I had expected. So that was kind of nice. And it's the same performance, incidentally, as you'd get in the next step up. This has got a 51 kilowatt hour battery. The next step up is 64 kilowatt hours and 125 kilowatts, 150 kilowatts, right? But the extra weight of the battery, and batteries are bloody heavy things, so the extra weight of the battery offsets the potential gain in performance from the extra 25 kilowatts, the bottom line being the straight line performance of both of those platforms is the same. When you get to the top of the range, it's got this 77 kilowatt hour battery and it's got 180 kilowatts of power. It absolutely performs better. It's like on paper, it's got to perform better, right? Because you just look at the weight and the power output and you know that's how it's going to be. And my comments about the Dolphin, like the base model Dolphin earlier, the base model Dolphin has only got 70 kilowatts. So 125 for the MG4 Excite 51 versus 70 for the Dolphin. Now, I know that not everyone buys a car to go racing in, but 70 kilowatts is inadequate in a vehicle that size. It just is. It's going to feel terrible. And you don't have to be the kind of person who needs to set the lap record for it to feel terrible. You just need the car to perform adequately, right? And it's not going to do that with the base model Dolphin because that is an inadequate power output for that car. So you need to bear that in mind. The saving is like $100. And with the MG, you get another year's worth of warranty, 7 years versus 6 for BYD, and you get a proper dealer network, so there's that. So for all of these reasons, I'd suggest that this is the sweet spot affordable EV right now, okay? It really is. And if this was your second car, and if you had rooftop solar, okay, if you had off-street parking, and if you work from home, you're never going to pay to charge it. You just don't need it. It's got an adequate battery to do the running around that you need to do. And if you're at home and you plug it in when the sun is shining, you'll never need a fast charge. But you do need those things, and plenty of the people who are in the box seat for an EV don't, for example, have access to a charger where they live. Plenty of apartments don't have that. Plenty of people in semi-detached houses or, any sort of high-density living arrangement close to the CBD, a lot of those people don't have off-street parking. So the charging thing is going to be a problem for anybody in that category. But for me, if I could flatten out my driveway a bit, it's dead simple. Work from home, back up here, plug in, Bob's your mother's brother. So this, and we've really got to think about what is the structure of a dwelling with a family inside it, and what are the automotive needs of average people close to cities like that. And many of those people need a car. They need two cars because often they need one party, or half of the family needs to be here and half the family needs to be there. And I'd suggest that the MG is really good as the second car, or the A to B car, like the hack car. It's really good at that, because if you've got, for example, an SUV, and SUVs are a really popular category, much more popular than cars in Australia. So lots of families have an SUV, but they need a second car because Jemima needs to be at harpsichord fucking practice when Jimmy's doing soccer or something, right? And Dad needs a car to go over here while Mommy needs to go and visit her parents, whatever. There's a 1,000 different combinations if we need the split like that. And then there's other combinations where the whole family just needs to do hack running around. You need to go to the shops, or you need to go out for dinner at a local restaurant or something of that nature. And if that's you, then an electric car makes real sense for that running around. Whereas if you need to drive a longer distance, your SUV is going to be better at that. It just is. For example, we'll get into the criticisms in a bit, but there's no spare tyre with most EVs, and the MG4 is no exception. So you really are throwing caution to the wind if you do remote sort of regional driving. And I don't mean 4x4 adventuring, I just mean driving in the regions, and from time to time you'll be in a place without cell phone coverage and Murphy strikes right there and you get a flat tire. What are you going to do? It's going to be kind of boring for hours and hours on end if you don't have cell phone coverage and the little compressor kit in the car with its sealant package is inadequate to patch up the 6-inch gash in the sidewall from the flat that you just got, right? So your SUV is going to be better at this long distance travelling, but all of the hack running around, the short trips and that, the EV is going to be fantastic for that. It's the space inside an MG4 is beyond adequate for a average family. You know, it's like Corolla size. So a couple of kids in the back, you can fold the seats down and you can fit a couple of bikes in the back, foldy bikes, whatever. There's plenty of room to go to Bunnings. If you've got row 2 folded, there's a bit of a lip. It's like this high. And you've got to get over the lip, obviously, but the hatchy sort of nature of the MG4 gives it a really big cargo volume inside with row 2 folded. So if Dad has a Bunnings objective in mind, many things in a big box from Bunnings will fit in the back of an MG4 with the seats folded flat. And, you know, you could even take one of the kids with you to indoctrinate them into the, you know, the sausage sandwich, etc. on Saturday morning at Bunnings. So all of that is reasonably positive, I know. And save up your questions for about another 10 minutes, right? And then we'll get into them in the comments feed. I'll be interested to get onto that. But I just want to deal with the criticisms right now and then how this car freaking upended me. It looks like a world-class upending of me after 35-ish years of trying really, really hard not to get upended by cars, okay? Anyway, so when you get in this car, like the outside is quite car-like, but when you get in it, it's like an extension of your smartphone. It's a digital appliance inside, much more than a car. Obviously, it's got legacy controls, like a steering wheel, and a couple of wands. It's got the wand for the indicators and the wand for the wipers. And it's got the 2 pedals on the floor. That's all nice. Everything else, digital. Okay, instead of a conventional instrument display, there's a tablet in front of you, and then there's a secondary tablet in the center for the HVAC and the infotainment and Android Auto and all of that stuff, Apple CarPlay, right? Now, that's fine. It all works. You get more than enough information coming back towards you, but there's going to be a learning curve for that. There just is. So you'll have to spend the time to accommodate that difference. And then there's my principal criticism of this car from an ergonomics point of view, and that would be that the steering wheel is terrible and I hate it. Okay, and I'm not exaggerating, it is terrible and I do hate it, and you'd have to make friends with it because you're going to interact with it every time you drive the car. So it's flat on the top and the bottom, and that's what I hate about it, because the ideal shape for a steering wheel is round, obviously, because then if you're feeding it through your hands quickly, its uniformity poses no impediment to feeding it through quickly. If it's got these bumps and corners and flat spots, then you really do have to concentrate to feed it through your hand quickly, and it doesn't feel nice. And I get that some wheels of necessity can't be flat. Like in a race car, it can't be round. In a race car, you've got to have a flat spot on the bottom because the cockpit is often so cramped that the driver can't get his legs into the car and can't operate a wheel with a round bit at the bottom, and you're only ever using your hands like this on a race circuit anyway. So a flat bottom makes perfect sense as a compromise. MG designers, for whatever reason, without these kind of operant constraints, have put flat spots top and bottom, and I can only assume that this is a concession to styling, which feels terrible. And also the flat spot on top does impinge on your view of the top of the tablet ever so slightly, and that's not ideal either. So that's a thing that you just have to come to terms with if you own that car. And the other thing is there's some quirky things that they could have just done better. Like in a conventional car, you've got this centre console and forward area, which would traditionally have a transmission hump underneath it. No transmission hump with this, obviously, because you've just got an electric motor at the back, so you don't actually need a drive shaft down there, so you don't actually need that hump in the floor. And instead what they've done is just replace all of that with empty space, which to me is a little bit like saying that me sitting on the lounge eating Doritos and sipping beer, watching the footy is my chosen sport. It's like replacing something with nothing in the centre here. It's just got this empty space, and I'm not sure what an advantage that really is, because to me it seems like a missed opportunity. And there is some storage down here, but you kind of got to lean over to get to it because it's so far down there on the floor, whereas if it was just a little bit higher you could reach the stuff that you had there, and you could have other slots for a laptop or something else because it's a charging opportunity. Which brings me to the transmission selector and the handbrake, which there's just back from the instrument panel a little bit. There's this protrusion which is cantilevered back towards you underneath the HVAC controls, and that houses a rotary switch for the transmission selector and a little pull-up switch for the parking brake. And that's fine, okay? And you just have to accommodate the difference in transmission selection. If you're used to doing this, park, reverse, neutral, drive, and over here for sport mode, and then you can go sort of Tiptronic backwards and forwards if you want. You don't get that with a car like this. You get a rotary switch, which is drive over here, neutral in the middle, reverse over this way, and press down for park. Okay, that's fine, works fine. And the switch for the parking brake also works fine. They cheaped out a little bit for us over in right-hand driveville, because in right-hand driveville you'd put the rotary switch over near the driver, whereas it's over on the left. So you just have to reach a little bit further over to get to that if you live in Australia or any other right-hand drive market. That's a concession to America and other places where they drive over there. That's not a big deal, I suppose, and the control architecture is not a big deal, but what they've done with the USB ports is they've put it underneath this cantilevered protrusion, so you've got a single USB-A underneath this cantilevered platform and a single USB-C. You can't see the USBs from the driver's seat, so if you want to plug something in or if you want to access a USB port, your vision of the road is up here. And you got to take your eyes off the road to do that. So don't do that. But it would have been so much easier to put the USB ports somewhere where they're just visible. And let's face it, every time you drive the car, you're going to be plugging your phone into the USB port. And if you need to get the cable in, it's like this. Whereas you could just, if it was in a better ergonomic position. So I think that void next to you as you drive along could have been far better managed, and frankly they could have put more USB ports there, because everyone has a digital life. There's likely to be two people in the front and they're likely to have a laptop and or a tablet and or a phone, so there's multiple devices that need charging. And given the fact that you've got 51 kilowatt hours of battery just down there under your ass, then we could have had more USB ports. There's only one USB port in the back, so the kids can fight over that as you drive wherever, which would be impossibly emotionally uplifting, because you know that they're both going to get into the car with their phones nearly flat. So there's that. I don't want to seem like I'm being overly critical, though, because this car really is impressive. It's just that no car's perfect, and it would be remiss of me not to point out the things that I didn't like about it. One of the other things, and they're all doing it, all manufacturers of EVs, or every EV that I've ever driven is like this. They've all got all of this packaging, and in fact in car companies they're obsessed with packaging, right? Packaging meaning how we're going to put the interior together and how we're going to make it maximally nice, and how we're going to put all of those things in the engine bay, even though there's no engine really in an EV, but the packaging of all the equipment, the inverter and the wiring, and they're obsessed with it. And yet The thing that you're probably going to use quite often, which would be the standard charging cable, it comes in a glorified cheap-assed nylon sports bag. You know, it's terrible. It's the worst integrated thing in every EV. Like, I lived with a Kona Electric for a year. It had that. Every time you pick up an EV that's 60, 70, 80,000 bucks, it's got this explosion in a cable factory with a box in the middle and a plug on each end, which is the standard charging cable. And nobody in the design realm has given a rat's ass about how to integrate that into the actual car, which frankly is disgraceful, because we've had EVs on the road for several years now, and this integration could be far better managed in my view. And you do need to come to terms with the no spare tyre thing, okay? So if you are going to buy one car and live with it, then you will be rolling the dice for regional travel. And I'd suggest, to the extent that a car like this is really not right for you, because if you've got cell phone coverage, you can call roadside assistance, that's fine. If you've got a big hole in the tyre, like it comes with a 12-volt compressor and a little tube of gooey stuff that is meant to block up little holes in the tyre, like from a nail or something. That's fine. That works just fine. You can get yourself going just fine. If you've got a bigger slash in the sidewall or something than that, then it's not repairable and you're going to need roadside assistance. I actually came across a woman in that predicament in a multi-storey car park at the San Hospital on Cancer Day for my father. So I'm taking him there. I've dropped him off for his treatment, and I'm coming back to the car, and I'm not in my best frame of mind. And I look at I think it was a Hyundai Ioniq, and it was sitting diagonally down like this, and it had a woman about my age in it with her elderly father, and I'm joining the dots on that. And she's in exactly that predicament. She's obviously stressed because of the situation she's in. She's hit the curb on the way up the ramps because they're sort of designed really tight. And anyway, one thing's led to another. There's a big slash in the sidewall, and I'm thinking, well, you get roadside assistance here, but they're going to tow the car, right? That's the only way you can fix it. So they're going to tow it to a dealership and get a new tyre and fit it. And how do you get the tow truck up there? You don't. You've got to drive it on the flat tyre, which could damage the rim, so then you'd be up for a rim as well. And I'm thinking, this is unnecessarily complex, because, and it's in the middle of a city. It's not like out in the boonies. Just if you're out in the boonies, you could have exactly the same predicament and be out of mobile range, and the sun could be setting, and you know the banjos could be tuning up all around, and it could be hilariously entertaining for all concerned, except you, of course. So for driving around the city, that's going to be fine. But if you want to use it for driving in the regions, get used to playing Russian roulette with flat tyres would be my advice. Now, before I get into your questions, start firing them through now. I'm going to tell you how this car upended me. I do this circuitous route from Sydenham back to my home, and I stop at my ageing parents' place to make sure I'm still in the wheel, right? I back into the driveway, because I always back into the driveway. I like leaving in a forward direction, and I do the kinds of stuff you do when you park a car and you're preparing to get out of it. So I back up, I go, yeah, okay, this is me, and then I hit park, and it goes into park, and I turn the handbrake on. What do you do next? In every car, you press the off button, or you turn the key. This doesn't have that whole ignition barrel thing. It's a proximity key jigger, so I'm looking for a button to press to turn the car off, and I can't find it. Like, I look in all the places where a button is likely to be. I look on below the instrument panel, right? No button. I look on the steering column. No button. And then I start looking in kooky places, like in the absence of center console. Can't find a button there either. And I nearly resorted to the admission of defeat, which is phoning home, like E.T., phone home, right? And the last thing I want to do is admit that I can't figure out how to turn a car off. Like, anyway, so here's what happened. I jump out of it, principally just to get a better view of, a different view of all of the places where a button might be, and I shut the door and I lock it, and guess what? it boots down, it powers down. Everything powers down. And then I go, that can't be how you power it down. And I try it again, and same thing. By this time, my aging parents are on the balcony going, "The fuck is he doing?" And then I think, well, how do I get it going again? Because when you unlock it and open the door, it doesn't boot up. How do I turn it on? How do I get the engine turning and burning in this thing? And like, I lived with an EV for a year. So anyway, I unlock it, I open the door. Both of the tablets are just black, and it's looking back at me, dead as a dingo's donger kind, desiccated dingo's donger kind of thing. And I get in it and I sit on the driver's seat, and it boots up for driving. Everything comes to life. I get the MG logo magically with all star-spangled whatever, and it just boots for driving. The transmission selector is illuminated, and both the tablets are illuminated, and it's ready to be turned around for driving and take the handbrake off and go again. So I get out of it and I lock it. And I unlock it and open it, and I go, and I press on the seat base, and it boots for driving. So the on switch is actually the seat waiting to feel your buttocks, right? And as soon as we get engagement with your buttocks, it boots for driving. And then I thought, I detest that. It's so much different from every other in-car activation and deactivation experience I've ever had. And I've wired that in for, like, I've been driving for 40-something years, so I've got that wired in, and I've got to unwire it for this car. And then I thought, is that terrible or just smarter? Is it better? I still can't decide if it's better. It's certainly simpler. It's one less thing to do. You just commence docking procedures with your ass, and car's good to go. And then you just get out of it. Like, you get out of it running and shut the door and lock it, and it boots down. It powers down, right? And then you just docking procedures with your ass, and it's booted up for driving. So I'd love to know what you think about that. Is that better or worse overall? And if you could just get your conditioning, because we're all conditioned to manually turn the car on for driving, boot it for driving, and power it down. If you take that to one side, just let me know in the comments if you think that's better or worse. Now, that's basically what I've got to say about the MG4 Excite 51. I really do think this is much more like the car Middle Australia needs for EV adoption to become more of a widespread thing, because it's affordable, and particularly with the federal government subsidies. And you can just go to my website if you want to know more about that. Click on the tab up the top that says novated lease. So that's autoexpert.com.au, and just click on novated lease, and there'll be a whole bunch of information about the subsidies and thresholds and all of that crap. So if you don't mind now, I'm going to get into the comments feed here, and I'll just answer some questions in real time to the extent that I can. So this will take a little bit of doing. Another issue is cold weather charging. This is from MH08. Cold weather charging, MH08 says. There's a channel where this guy tests EVs in Colorado when it got to minus 20 degrees F, which is pretty freaking cold. It's like 50 degrees F below zero. So about 25 below zero. In Australia, yeah, cold is a thing. There's some counterintuitive things about EVs. In a combustion car, you've got so much waste heat that heating anything is not a problem. Whereas, and you can always run the alternator harder if you need to heat something up with electricity, right? Whereas it's a bit more like Apollo 13 with an EV. Certainly your amount of electricity is a zero-sum game. So anytime you extract electricity to heat the wing mirrors, that's electricity that you no longer have access to for forward motion, right? So heating anything is a real problem, and the cold does definitely impact the range significantly. There's that. Towing is another thing that impacts the range dramatically, and so does getting out on the highway. This is the exact opposite of combustion. See, with combustion, when you get out on the highway, that sort of low throttle constant speed, 80 to 100 k's an hour. That's really efficient running for a combustion engine. And it's exact opposite for an EV, because as soon as you've been driving an EV around, like I drove an EV6 around Canberra a bit and then got onto the highway, and I had like 250 k's of range notionally on the computer driving around the burbs of Canberra. And then I get out onto the federal highway and I do 100 k's an hour and the range goes, it just plummets. And that's because aerodynamic drag spikes and there's no efficiency gain by virtue of running the electric powertrain at that same sort of operating conditions as highway driving. It just doesn't work like that. So aerodynamic drag increases with the square of speed, and that means your range is likely to be substantially less than you would expect if you're going by the trip computer. That's something to bear in mind. Let's have another look at the comments feed here. People actually want everyone to be miserable. If you read enough comments, it's mind-boggling. Yeah, that is. But could you ask me about EVs? Like, in particular, this one. Happy to answer some questions about the MG4 Excite 51. Lockie Begg says, hey John, answer please. So when I have a fender bender, what happens? Is it written off, i.e. battery stability? Who makes this call? Who can access and fix? Well, this is a real thing. Insurance cost for EVs is definitely a thing. And the repair scenario, the repair of cars generally is a real cottage industry thing. And we've got this large amount of time where all repairers have been competent at repairing all of the systems in a combustion car. So the fuel system, powertrain system, the body integrity and all of that stuff. Whereas I think insurers are being hyper conservative when it comes to the assessment of crash damaged EVs, and many of those are being written off in situations where they need not be written off. And that's to avoid liability down the track, because if some assessor says, no, she'll be right, and then you go and repair that car and deliver it to the customer and he parks it in his driveway and it has a catastrophic thermal runaway that evening and 5 people are dead as a consequence, which is quite likely to happen, then that's a disaster. It's a disaster for the dead people. It's a disaster for the firefighters who are exposed to the toxic chemicals, and it's a liability disaster for the insurers. So they're making those decisions to write cars off. They're being very conservative about it. And the other thing we need urgently, and unfortunately we need this from arsehole politicians, so don't be breath holding on it. We need the batteries of EVs to be recycled. And that needs to be mandated. We need legislation that gives some agency the procedural policing of the recycling of batteries. And somebody needs to have custody of that responsibility, and they need to be prosecuted if it's not done, because when you extract all those materials, the aluminium, the cobalt, the lithium, whatever, we were told that this is meant to be a circular economy. Batteries are supposed to be renewable. And in fact, in places like the United Kingdom, that's not happening at all. And they're much further down the track of EV adoption than us. And what you get in these big salvage operations is you just get endless shipping containers full of batteries, and they're not being recycled. They're just being Erin Brockoviched for the future. And I don't want lithium hexafluorophosphate and cobalt leaching into the groundwater, because that's an unmitigated environmental fucking disaster, and the likes of Albo and Chris Bowen, etc., need to get off their lardy arses and legislate the recycling of batteries, because at the moment it's down to individual corporations and the free market, and we know that they always act in society's best interest, don't we? So there's that. Now, let's look at Cow Sweatman. Cow Sweatman is a regular commentator on the program. He says, why would anyone object to being within 15 minutes of anywhere you want to go? Better than tarmac, car park, deserts and alien landscapes. So, well, that's right. There is a certain... I know where this conversation is emanating from. There's a certain conspiracy theorist group who seem to think that EVs and the whole climate agenda are just there to restrict everyone's movements and impose control. And to those people, I'd suggest that maybe just a few more layers of alfoil in the cap, dude, because that's not where this is. But certainly life would improve, I think, for many people if they lived closer to work. That used to be an imperative because in horse and cart days you couldn't live 100 k's from your frickin' job, could you? But you certainly can now. In Sydney, for example, there are plenty of people, my eldest son included, who lives on the Central Coast and commutes to various building sites where he's a foreman. And his commute is certainly more than 50 or 60 k's each way, and probably, depending on the site he's working at, sometimes 100. So he can quite often travel a couple of 100 k's each day just getting to and from work. And I get the feeling like his life would be better and certainly full of less stress if he was like 10 k's away from his job. And I've got to say that I live about 8 metres from my job. Like my bedroom is like 8 to 10 metres that way, kind of thing. And my life, I don't miss the commute. Like, I don't at all. I never think, wouldn't it be great to just get the train every day or just to drive in traffic? It's been ages since I've been stuck in traffic. One of the best things you can do for the drain on natural resources represented by you is to live closer to the things you do regularly. And that's not an example of control being imposed by the CIA. That's an example of you getting more of your life back, because that's not driving. That's wasting your life in traffic. Anywho, let's just go on for a little bit longer. Adam Mansbridge on turning on and off. Adam's a regular commentator as well. G'day, mate. How you going? He says, turning on and off. Tesla cars turn on when you unlock them and off when you lock them. If you use your phone as the key, that means it turns on when you walk up to it and off when you walk away. Yeah, look, I'm of two minds about it. One of the dangers, of course, is mashing all of this technology, present generation technology and older technology together, right? So if we get a whole bunch of new drivers who just get used to the fact that walking up to your car turns it on with your phone and walking away from your car shuts it down, one day they're going to drive a car that's 10 years old and they're just going to leave it stopped and booted, ready to drive, and just walk away from it. Someone's going to get in it and drive away, aren't they? So there's that. And there's also the potential danger of doing things of that nature when you think about it, because a kid could get in and just fuck around inside the car and it could move forward and disaster could happen there when it rolls through the front wall of somebody's lounge room when they're watching reruns of the frickin' Brady Bunch or something. So there's that. Richard Love, who says, at Cal Sweatman, why would you give the freedom away? Just buy your EV with your blah, 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 blah. Okay, so we're having a conspiracy theoretical discussion now. That's always uplifting, isn't it? James Westwood says, I've had the MG4 for about a month and driven about 2,000 miles, almost been pitched off the road with lane keep assistance on every drive. It's scary. Yeah, you know what? I didn't find that. I didn't find any of those safety systems too interventional at all. Maybe I just, drove between the lines a bit more often than the average punter. I'm not sure, but I didn't notice any of that stuff reaching in and taking control and doing things particularly differently than I would. And I'd suggest that the intervention of these systems is generally overridable by the driver anyway, because they'd be torque limited, right? And you'd be able to get on top of that. I do hate lane keeping assistance generally, because often I want to clip the lane marking over here just to make the corner smoother. And as soon as you do that, you get all these warnings like, it's going to be the plague of frogs and rivers running as blood and all of that shit. And I certainly hate that. Rev Nation says, trying to get the government to be the solution for you is a fool's errand, my friend. Yeah, well, maybe that's true, but we certainly do need regulation, because OceanGate, etc., right? We need regulatory framework because the free market never gets it right when left to its own devices. And certainly overzealous regulation kind of sucks. You see that on the road all the time. You know, this zealous prosecution of speeding just because it makes money sort of thing is an example of that. What we need is a balance. We need to avoid having endless acres of shipping containers out there in some back paddock over a ridge out of plain sight with shipping containers full of freaking lithium batteries that could be repurposed but aren't being so because it's just not economically rational. We need to avoid that. We'll just do a few more of these and then my work here will be done because I sort of thought we'd do this for about an hour. Anyway, if you're thinking about buying this car, I hope it's been worthwhile for you. And I do thank you sincerely for tuning in to my ranting about all of this. Big fella says, John, did you read the story the other week about Toyota developing a solid-state battery on the cheap and a claimed 1,200 kilometre range? Yeah, I got a really significant comment to make about all of these stories you see in the media about new battery technology. They're usually all bullshit. They're right up there with the new diet, okay? The media is biased, and not in the way you think generally. The media is biased towards laziness and sensationalism. So when a press release lobs about new battery technology, there was one in The Guardian in I think October last year about how the shells of crabs and lobsters could be used to make new renewable batteries. And I thought, yeah, this is emblematic of this bullshit, right? Because I'm only interested in new battery technology when they're building the factory. When they're building the factory that's going to make 1 million batteries a week, I'd be really interested in that new technology. Sodium batteries, solid-state batteries, supercapacitors, miraculous batteries made of fucking lobster shells, right? Show me the factory. When that's about to get out of the blocks, I'd be really interested in that. But until then, it's just a nice idea. And science is full of nice ideas. Most research fails, okay? So sodium batteries, solid-state batteries, renewable batteries, all of this stuff. The problem with batteries is that the periodic table of elements is known. There is no new element technology to be exploited. There's just fluffing around the edges that we could do. And you can make batteries with sodium, for example. There's no problem with that, except they probably explode or not live for very long before failing in various different ways, right? So there are technical problems with the deployment of alternative chemistries, and it's extremely long-winded and difficult to get this out of the blocks. Lithium batteries, lithium-ion batteries, have been around since the 90s. They were commercialised in the 90s, I think. So we've been playing with them for 30 years. It's a bit like fusion power. Sodium batteries are only 6 months away, and in 2030 they're going to be just 6 months away. That's the way with much of this new technology. It's like full self-driving. Just ask Electric Jesus about that. Now, Michael Hudson says, how could someone justify purchasing a new EV in a regional area that has only a barely functioning Toyota dealership, no 5G and not a single charging station to be seen? Well, the charging station, if you've got rooftop solar, you could charge it up there. Servicing is going to be a problem if it's a few hundred Ks away because that'll be beyond the range of the EV. And I don't really think EVs are targeted really heavily at regional users. I really don't think that's the case. You might have a delivery run in a regional city and you might be able to use an EV for that. If you've got charging at the premises, no problem, okay? But servicing, there is going to be specialist servicing requirements for EVs. There's certainly going to be not so much servicing in the meaning oil changes, etc., because obviously that doesn't need to take place. But one of the things that's really going to need to happen is fault finding and fixing, because they're going to fuck up just as often as combustion cars, and they're going to need specially trained technicians to get to the bottom of it and order in the parts and fit them. They're going to need special training so that they don't electrocute themselves while they're working on the high voltage system. So, yeah, the repair thing is a real issue, and not enough work is being done on that either. Now, Nahan's goofy videos with a donation of $5. Thanks, Nahan. He says, I left the key on my scooter once or twice when I switched from a keyless one to a physical key. Both Honda 125cc scooters habits die hard. They absolutely do. Spencer Howard, also with a donation of $5. Thank you so much. I'll buy coffee with that later. He says, Spencer says, I keep arguing with numpties about battery chemistry I learned in high school. That said, I think CATL has a production plant of sodium cells ramping up now. Yeah, look, scientific literacy is really important, and not enough is being made of that either, mainly because politicians are kind of overwhelmingly washed up lawyer assholes who seem to think that everything is amenable to debate or negotiation. And things like battery chemistry is really not a matter of negotiation. It's really a matter of the periodic table and the facts. It's a bit like gravity. If you're up on the balcony after 6 beers and it's 10 stories up, you're not going to be able to, and you're a lawyer asshole, you're not going to be able to negotiate a softer landing if you slip, okay? This is that. And because the world is going to be increasingly driven by technology, by STEM basically, if you're not scientifically literate, you will be left behind. That's just how it is. I have lost track of the amazement I've felt from time to time reading the comments. I just read it and I think, this is from people often with good jobs, you know, but not STEM type jobs, just, you know, vitally important sales reps or something. And I just read the comments and I go, are you really that fucking stupid? You know, I really do. Are you really that oblivious to how the STEM part of the world on which all of the luxuries that you enjoy are based? Like, you get in a plane and you fly 1,000 kilometres, which is nothing. You do that, you've got STEM to thank for that. You drive across a bridge, you've got STEM to thank for that. All these people are, you've got the internet, right? All these people have got all of that, and yet they're like, yeah, well, I'll just negotiate about gravity, or I'll just negotiate about sodium batteries are going to change the game and all of this stuff, right? One of the biggest impediments to rolling out EVs is the availability of the materials. This is a STEM thing, okay? In a conference, a big mining conference in WA, and I don't have the details in front of me right now, but this was in the 3rd quarter or 4th quarter of last year, the boss of lithium extraction for Rio Tinto got up and she said words to the effect of, we've modelled the demand for batteries into the future, and we've modelled the production of lithium, and we've included in our model all the projected lithium plants, and we don't see how the demand for lithium can be met over the next several decades, right? So if that's just some punter down the pub, Trev down the pub says, oh, well, lithium, I don't think they'll be able to make enough. That's different to the boss of lithium for Rio Tinto saying that, you know what I mean? So what I'm suggesting is that everybody owes it to themselves, and in particular their children, to advocate for them to be more scientifically literate than they are now, because that's how the world rotates, right? And if you're not part of understanding that, you'll be left behind, increasingly left behind. There's going to be fewer jobs for dumb shits, for example. And I hate to put it like that, but really there is that divide in society. There's people who understand STEM. This is how it works in my head. There's people with a basic understanding of STEM, and there's a whole bunch of dumb shits who just hope stuff works, right? And if you're in this category, you're going to be increasingly left behind. You're going to be unable to even vote in an informed way about things that really matter for the future. Anyway, I think with that, we might call this live stream quits. And I really would like to thank you for joining me, if you stuck with me for the whole thing. It's been a bit of a blast doing this. I haven't been live on YouTube for a while, but I have enjoyed it, and hopefully you've got something out of it as well, particularly in relation to your decision. If you're up there sitting on the fence going, will I buy an EV next or won't I? I'd strongly suggest that an MG4, for a great many reasons, is an EV that you should consider because of its overall accessibility and the fact that it's pretty well executed, albeit with some less than perfect aspects that you will have to accommodate if you jump down off the fence and grab it. Anyway, I'll catch you on the next video. Thanks very much for joining me.